the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, which we've been talking about a bit lately, has a new report out that I think is extremely important. I would really encourage you all to read it. As you know, on this program, we're talking a lot about the global system and what's wrong with this. And this is a great report on that. It is entitled Hyper-Imperialism. That's with a hyphen. So Hyper-Imperialism, a dangerous, decadent new stage. We don't have to tell you of what, I think you know. And joining me now to talk about that report is one of its co-authors, Mikaela Erskog, that's Erskog, almost like my name. Mikaela Erskog is a researcher with the Tricontinental Institute, and as I say, one of the co-authors of this report. So first of all, Mika, thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you so much for having me and for being willing to discuss this, because that's pretty much what we're trying to do right now, is talk to as many people as we can about some of the concepts and the findings we discovered in this study.
Well, it really is quite interesting. First of all, I was pleased to see, all of these various facts and figures and historical events assembled into a pattern. I think that this sort of pattern recognition is what missing way too often. Why don't we start with this? What was the original inspiration or thought or motivation for doing the report in the first place? Can you tell us about that?
Sure. So I think there were three things out of many things that we could pick that were kind of the core behind what drove this study and the research behind it. Is one, progressive geopolitical commentators, left organizations often have, of course, a very compelling conception of the world and the balance of forces. But what has been missing is up-to-date, facts and statistics to back the arguments and back their conception and analysis of the world. So one is that we wanted to try to, we went through huge data sets, World Bank data, IMF data, and try to bring it all together so that we can have, a concrete analysis based on the concrete reality. So that was one. The second is that at this stage, has been a tendency, and I'm from Africa. I'm largely working with the National Union of Metal Workers in South Africa for many years. One of the things that has been an ongoing issue, I think, in the left is the question of the state of imperialism, or the state of the powers in the world. So we hear narratives about China's colonizing Africa, Russia as an imperialist force. And we wanted to kind of engage with this idea because we think it's a misplaced conception. That in fact, if you look at the data, if you look at the reality, there aren't many imperialisms. There's one imperialism that is largely driven by the US, which leads a concrete bloc in the global north. And that we can see this by, for example, one of the big findings we had from our collaborations with other researchers was military spending. That the US military budget, which is every year is reported by the Stockholm Peace Institute. Yeah,
I think it's Institute for Peace or something. Yeah. I know the one you mean. I use their data as well. Yeah.
Yeah, we all did up until this point. But what we found from our research is that, of course, they take into account what a government says is their defense budget, right? But a defense budget doesn't take into account different arms and aspects that support the military. So the energy sector, veterans budgets, etc., aren't accounted for. And what we found that the number that SIPRI estimated for 2022, around 800 billion, was almost half of what we've up until now been able to gather. And in fact, the US spends 1.5 trillion US dollars, double the amount that they report in their kind of, annual reports. And we thought this was important because we can't fully understand the balance of powers, the geopolitical landscape, without understanding that the US has this disproportionate investment into military spending. And if you add the, NATO plus, that's including NATO, including Japan and others who are kind of allies and dialogue partners, the global North US-led military bloc accounts for 75% of military spending. And this was important because, this argument that it's an equal terrain between China and the US. China's military spending is only 12% of actually it's low, I think it's around 10% in 2022 of world spending. Russia's even lower, it's around 5%. So we thought it was important to show that there is this asymmetry, and that if we don't understand this asymmetry, at least in military capacity, we won't have a real understanding of how do we change the situation. I mean, of course, people I think are more open and convinced of these facts now after what's happened in Gaza with Israel's, criminal raising of the territories and the people. But it was an opportune moment. And as you saw in the title, we said hyper-imperialism. And we particularly wanted to make that intervention because we wanted to say that even though it has this military strength, this global domination that's led by the US and its various allies, it's also in a stage where it's kind of frenetic. There's also, the word hyper, you think like over-energized, kind of dangerous. And that's also an important aspect, that there's a little bit of instability at its core, which has to do with the fact that it's gradually been losing strength in its economic strength. I mean, by 2007, China had, in PPP terms, had already outpaced the share of the world GDP. It also has to do with the fact that it's losing monopolies in certain important sections like technology. It's losing its grip on energy. And so we also did want to say that even though it's this behemoth of a monster in military terms, we also wanted to show that there are other cracks in the face of this global North-led domination of the world, and that it's important for countries, particularly in the global South, to understand this if we want to wage a campaign to, reclaim the wealth of the world for the people who need it the most.
And I liked your explanation, Mika, of hyper. The analogy that came to mind when I was reading the report was when there are firestorms during a forest fire, like the forest fires we've had a lot of here in the state. Uh, there comes a point where the forest fires start, the disparate fires start to come together and form a giant storm that runs out of control. And that's the sort of acceleration that the firefighters always fear, that, and that's the feeling I got out of the report a little bit, was that this has always been a kind of military train, running over the landscape, and now it's a runaway train. That was the feeling I got, that this has taken on a momentum of its own, a volition of its own in a way, and that we have a global system guided by the U.S., perhaps less still, enormous economic force and suasion, but more so just in terms of the massive uh, runaway motion of this military machine. And it strikes me that, uh, first of all, did it surprise you all when you were working on it, the extent of this? And secondly, did it give you any insights about the sort of forces at play causing this to accelerate the way it has been?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean,
Big
one is
questions,
that,
I know. Yeah.
and I'll just say what we, again, just maybe for those who are listening to know that this was a big collective project. We had feedback and input and reviewers from all over the world, from, trade union leaders to, peasant organization leaders to intellectuals. It was very much a collaborative effort, and it's more an invitation on how can we sharpen our tools of analysis if we want to, change the reality. I mean, we live in a world where recently it was reported that 2.4 billion people 2.4 billion people are food insecure. I mean, this isn't a world that, I think there was a statistic a few years ago that was, we create so much food, but that goes to waste. That is like, I don't know, I can't remember the figure right now, but so much food goes to waste. Farmers are the most food insecure of the population. The people that produce food aren't able to even benefit from the work they're doing. So, with the big questions, one is that, and this is also part of the subtitle is called A Dangerous and Decadent New Stage, and I want to pick on the word decadent, is that what we discovered is that a lot of the global north powers, the dominating powers, don't have a project for humanity. It's power for the sake of power. This is not like with the French Revolution, where it was a bourgeois revolution, but they nonetheless had, equality, fraternity. What's the other one? Equality,
Equality,
fraternity,
liberty, fraternity.
liberty. Yes,
Yeah.
liberty. They had a project, and it was to say to people that you don't have to bow for monarchs anymore. We don't want this feudal system, and not endorsing what the bourgeois revolution ended up being, because of course it was for white men of the owning class, etc. But nonetheless, they had a project. Biden does not have a project for humanity. Macron does not have a project for humanity. None of them have a project, and so the decadence is the fact that they're desperately seeking to hold on to that power. And that's where we see the dangerousness of their military activities. I mean, the US has over 900 foreign military bases across the world. And if you look, those of you who are interested in the study can check it out. We have great visuals that accompany this, a lot of maps. But if you look at it, you can see this overreach with the military, because the US is in slow decline in certain key economic sections. But the other thing that we found that was important is that this term global south has kind of been brandied, loosely for the last few years. I mean, the foreign minister of Japan last year, I think it was, in a press conference was asked, what is the global south? And she basically said, well, it's sort of this, it's kind of the developing countries. And we think that we wanted to give a little bit more precision, because even though the global south doesn't have a collective project, doesn't have a collective political outlook, economic integration, etc., it still nonetheless has important groupings and tendencies that we need to understand. And that, unlike the global north, which is an integrated political, military, and economic bloc, the global south needs to basically get its act together. And we think, based on the mood we've seen since the Ukraine war, the mood we've seen is that there is an appetite for alternatives. And that has been facilitated by the rise of China, which gives, let's say in the case of Africa, we have more choices where we, in the last couple of decades, don't have to go to the IMF and then end up, restructuring our whole economic policy to benefit Western capitalist interests. We have also seen the rise of, if you take China out of the picture, the global south as a whole has a greater share of the world GDP than the global north, and also has a greater share of world manufacturing capacity. We've seen, Indonesia has grown immensely. It's now projected that in 2030 it will be the 5th largest economy. Malaysia, Saudi Arabia, all these different countries have grown significantly and changed significantly. And so we wanted to understand, what are then the tendencies in the global south, but also not overinflate the fact that at the end of the day, the political unity of the global north is one of their greatest assets. The G7 is basically the, political bureau of them. They then have NATO as their, institutional military power. Economically, since the Marshall Plan, essentially, Europe was subordinated to the US's interests, and therefore has a highly dependent relationship in ways that we don't necessarily see, even though we are seeing shifts not seen in 100 years. I mean, China and Russia now almost most of their trade is in their own currencies. We're seeing a lot of, BRICS was rising. We're seeing different multilateral organizations emerge. But nonetheless, we think that those are still in the nascent phase, and we need to appreciate what the characteristics, let's say, are. And we still have a lot more work to do in terms of being precise with the global south, but we thought it was important to at least present what are some of the tendencies. Like we have 6 groupings that we
Right. I saw
were thinking
that.
about. Yeah, and so, for example, one of them is the strongly seeking sovereignty, and that's a group that it constitutes countries like Iran, Russia, countries in the Sahel. In the last few years, Niger, Guinea, Burkina Faso, Mali have all had these very popularly supported military coups, which have basically ejected the French military presence and are trying to disentangle themselves from the kind of hangover of French colonialism. And those kinds of groupings represent a call for, sovereignty and self-determination in a moment in history in which most countries don't have full sovereignty because of their historical, colonialism, neocolonialism, IMF policies, etc.
Right.
And last, I'll say about this that I think was, for me at least, a learning curve is we also grouped the global north in different rings, but basically we wanted to show that at the core of the global north, and why we put them at the core, is countries that are highly integrated in terms of their intelligence. So
Okay. Hmm.
at the heart of it, there are about 4 rings, and at the heart of the rings is the US, the UK, New Zealand, Australia, and Israel. And for decades, they've had highly integrated intelligence services that share, that coordinate, that collaborate. Then the second ring, which is the Nine Eyes, were other countries like France, etc., that were integrated a few years later. But we wanted to show that there is this historical integration. They also share a common history, most of them colonialists, most of them genociders, most of them gained their wealth through looting the global south in one way or another. And therefore, we have a huge challenge because of the level of integration and the level of subordination of the global north to US interests.
And I wanted to say about this division, and we can explore the groupings and rings a bit more. But I wanted to say first of all that I found this fascinating for a couple of reasons, Mika. One was that we've seen certain signs of this north-south division, even though it's not as visible as it would have been, let's say, in the 1950s or 1960s, right, where you had the USSR to a much greater extent than China, which was still pulling itself together uh, as leading a global ideology. And you had the US leading a global ideology, if you can call it that, of capitalism. And at least there was a clear delineation. And when it came to North and South, roughly speaking, or developing countries versus developed countries, you could see, for example, that most revolutions, most anti-colonial revolutions were socialist in nature or communist in nature, and so on. So while you didn't have many independent third world country or developing countries yet, you saw that there was a kind of nascent ideological division. I think you make a great point that it's not so much ideological now as self-driven, but you see signs of something. I think, for example, of after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the U.S. wanted a uh, certain measure of sanctions against them passed, I believe it was, in the United Nations. I just remember the vividness. They showed the yes votes for this in yellow, I think, and the no votes in red. And it was almost as if not quite, it wasn't completely perfect, but it was almost as if the globe had been painted yellow on the top and red on the bottom, which suggested a distinction of interests, if not of ideology. But now you have a global South where, many of these independence movements that were socialist, for example, have become something else. It may vary. They may have been, as you say, derailed by IMF and other intervention, economic interventions, or what it might be. But it seems to me that even before we explore what needs to be done in the global north, that the global south uh, does not have a unifying theme, that somehow many of these revolutions have been co-opted or misdirected. Their leaders were either assassinated or sidelined early on or co-opted into a different kind of system. So it strikes me that's a rather large challenge. You have in your report, you have 6 socialist independent countries, you have 10 strongly sovereign seeking, and everything from the Islamic Republic of Iran to I don't know what else, and a couple that are heavily US militarized. So it strikes me as it's hard to know where to go with that. Do you have any thoughts, or is that just the job at hand when it comes to the global south?
Well, yeah, it's a huge challenge. I mean, in one of the groupings is 111 countries. So the Global South we constitute as 145 countries. The Global North has 49 countries. And 111 of them, we just kind of they don't have strong tendencies. Maybe they're too small, maybe, as you said, the politics has been diluted in the last couple of decades, etc. But I think, and this is where what's happening in Gaza is becoming more definitive, is
Hmm.
that the world's populations are starting to see, as you said, this huge divide. The Indonesians, came out in their millions in support. North Africans, of course, came out in support. South Africa was willing to say no, thank you. But part of and take their claim to the ICJ. But part of that, I think the underlying unifying factor is most of these countries are coming around to the fact that the plans of the IMF, the policies of the kind of US Western models aren't serving their people. And the people are trying to hold their governments accountable. I mean, we just had an election in Senegal where the youngest president in Africa was elected. And even though I think the party has some attractive programs and proposals, it was largely young people. Africa has the youngest population. The average age is 19 years old. Young, disenfranchised majority populations who are fed up with what they've seen, who are fed up with what's happening in the world, who have grown up in poverty, who might not know their history very well, but have a sense of the impact of colonialism, etc. I mean, the anti-French sentiment has been brewing in West Africa for decades now and is popularly supported. So what I'm saying this is to say that even though there are these kind of disparate tendencies, the populations are showing their disgruntlement in ways that we haven't necessarily seen in previous decades. And because of course, improvements in technology and telecommunications, etc., we're able to see this, right? We're able to see people's responses. And I think that gives a
Right.
feeling of the tide can turn and that your sentiment is shared with millions, if not billions of people. But the other part is that, as I mentioned, and I think it's important because I really do hate when I often have to talk about China-Africa relations and the role China has played, because regardless of what you think about China, regardless of what you think it's communist, it's this, it's that, fundamentally has changed the reality for many developing countries where it having some kind of economic security enables certain political will to take place. An
Right.
example I'll give is Namibia. Namibia, had a revolution, had a national liberation process. But when they were finally free from the South Africans in the early 90s, they quickly had to adopt many neoliberal economic policies. And so a lot of the, radical and revolutionary tendencies were undermined and compromised because they just had to, deal with being part of this international financial system. But in the last decade or so, they've been increasingly having more options, not only with China. I mean, even the Gulf states are playing a bigger role in many African countries in terms of infrastructure and investments. But I think through this longer process of having other options for investment to for pursuing development policies, it allows people to get more confidence in their politics. And we saw this when I think it was in not last year, it might have been in 2021, but the Prime Minister of Namibia was at the Munich conference. And she was one of the few voices who said, why are we spending so much money on war in Ukraine when we have all these other social security questions of feeding people, of taking care of people's health, etc. And I think that and part of what we think at Tricontinental, why she was able to have that confidence is because there's a little bit more maneuvering space, a little bit more
Right.
economic not independency, but a little bit more autonomy and to make certain political decisions that before you can't go out to the IMF, take their money, and then not talk the line. But now with the new options we have for our economic development, there's more space to cultivate more independent political views and political pursuits.
I think that's absolutely right, and it's a hopeful sign for the future that this may, we hope coalesce into a kind of alternative movement. I agree with your analysis completely. We also see the beginnings of, for example, an attempt to create a multi-state Latin American, South American currency that Lula in Brazil and a couple other state leaders are trying to put together. All is whether or not that particular project succeeds, all is indications that people are seeing that the financial hegemony that's been controlling things is not serving them in these countries and is dictating policies that are against their own population's interests. So I completely agree with that. And maybe it's a good time now to pivot just a bit to the global north, because we also see some of the phenomena that you're describing in the south in their own way beginning to take place in the north, I think. In other words, these 49 countries that are part of this system with the US as as the leading force, leading edge, whatever. Um, how do I put it? We have parts of the United States that are uh, in effect colonized and suffering. The UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights found that poor rural people in Mississippi, the state of Mississippi, uh, lack access to drinking water and other basic necessities of life. These primarily Black farming communities. We have Puerto Rico, which was treated like Greece and like some African countries in terms of after being abused by the financial system, in order to get back on its feet, was forced to submit its democratic processes to, excuse me, I'm having a little camera trouble there. Yeah, to to basically the international community, surrender their rights in that sense. And we're seeing populations. Puerto Rico in the United States also has gone through, a loss of, even though it's part of the United States, loss of its democratic rights. It's cities like Detroit, Michigan, lost their right to elect their own leaders at various points. So I think we're also seeing that there is a subpopulation or a demographic in these developing countries, or developed countries, excuse me, that also needs to be pushed back against this system, liberated from this system, is also beginning to see that, there was Occupy Wall Street, which took off in 2011. There was the Bernie Sanders movement, which showed a nascent sign of support for an alternative. There were the Women's March movement, all these incoherent in a way ideologically, some of them, but all of them expressing a growing discontent. Now, demonstrations here against the destruction of Gaza, the massacres in Gaza, and again, people are seeing here as well as overseas that we're seeing in Germany. I mean, the system is bearing its fangs, if you will. in certain parts of the world, people in this country are losing their jobs, losing their careers, being censored. The valedictorian of a college won't be allowed to give her traditional valedictory speech at the University of Southern California that every valedictorian gives because she's supports the rights of Palestinians and is Arab American. I mean, it goes on and on. So it seems to me that I posed the challenge of organizing the South, no mean task, but there's also, I think, a challenge slash opportunity in the North as well. And I wonder what you think of that.
No, of course. I mean, you know, Che Guevara said we have to create many Vietnams, and
Right.
um, Samora Machel from Mozambique used to say that solidarity is not an act of charity. It's about waging different battles on different battlefronts for a common cause. Um, so I think that in this moment, particularly with, and this is again the hyperness of it, the desperation, the decadence of it, is that more and more young people who are the ones who, as you said, are victimized by the system, are marginalized. I mean, the US, I always hear the horror stories of you get into huge student loan debt, and you
Oh,
can't even get a good
yeah.
job. You have to work many jobs. And I think that the I don't know if this is the best analogy, but it's almost like everyone sees that the emperor has no clothes on, you
Right.
know? It's like something of a veil has dropped. And people are seeing that how is it we're the so-called richest country in the world, but we have some of the poorest populations? And why is it when we want to have a productive conversation, the levels of violence that are meted out against us and the suppression that occurs is on a level unseen. I mean, remember the viral video of the in Italy, the people who were protesting for Gaza, like high school students, were just beaten by the police. And so I think the rise of fascism, as horrifying as it is across the world, is showing people that there's a problem on a structural level, a systematic or a systemic, sorry, issue that won't be resolved by, a little, maybe a few benefits here, maybe, you get this there, but that fundamentally, how is it that we have some of the richest people in the world, some of the biggest corporations, but we're not able to manage the basic needs of our population? And so I agree that there's a huge task for the, unorganized but uh, rebellious people who are emerging in the global north and who are seeing, I mean, for example, one of the things we talk about is the subordination of that Europe doesn't have an autonomous project. Europe doesn't have a project for itself, even, despite the fact that, they have, I mean, social welfare is slightly better or improved standard of life compared to many of the global south countries. But even there's no project that's not subordinated to the US. And of course, it has its historical roots. But places like Germany that, were industrial hubs essentially they were exported to the global south and completely, deindustrialized. One of the findings we had is that and there's not a lot of good measures for this because they make it purposefully hard to find this information, is that the ownership of the German stock exchange is predominantly foreign owned, which we can only imagine is predominantly US foreign owned. So I think that people are increasingly seeing, from the Ukraine war to Israel's genocide in Gaza, Europeans also increasingly seeing that their politicians don't have the interests of their populations. But the hope is that this feeling of disgruntlement doesn't transform into a kind of far right shift, because we've seen that phase already happen. But I think that there's still something definitely different about this point in history. Even though I think the fight against fascism is extremely important, and its growth around the world largely has to do with the fact that people do feel disenfranchised, but they fall into chauvinism and narrow national interests and self-interests rather than thinking about what this means for the world as a whole. Because ultimately, if the US continues to spend as it's spending on military, if we just think about the carbon footprint of the US military, it's the single largest institutional carbon emitter in the world. We won't have an Earth to live on if we don't decrease the military spending, if we don't demilitarize, if we don't, challenge the fact that these are the priorities of a very narrow elite.
Right, and
And
it's sure, of course.
one one thing though that I think is kind of hopeful in this moment is that, of course, a lot of the ruling elites in Europe and, well, the global north, the messaging that they tell their people, like I remember last year in January, the head of the European Council, the European Commission, and Jens, the NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, they signed a joint declaration, and what they said was, we will use any measure of military, political, and economic means to protect our 1 billion people, is what they said. And I also felt that, the division you talked about, of where you felt like the world was sliced in North versus South.
Right.
And so they will say that it's in the interest of their own people, but we know, based on the limits of the economic models that are dominating, in reality, people will see that this is not working. And so even though they're still, I think there's still an extreme challenge in terms of what they can do to mobilize fascistic ideas that then make, national patriotism all about Europeans for Europeans. What has happened in Gaza has been like a landmark that people see that there's no humanity to the type of project that the US is leading. There's no humanity to just their
No, you're
conception of how
absolutely
to
right.
coexist with other human beings.
And I think people are seeing that, and I think that is a hopeful sign for the future. And I think the report that you all have put together is a critical part of it. I'll be publishing a link to it and a couple excerpts at the Zero Hour Report, which is ESKOW at Substack.com, or you can find it directly at the Tricontinental.org. It's a terrific piece of work, an important step forward in our understanding and organizing process. So, Mikaela Erskog, thanks for your work on it, and thanks so much for coming on the program. We depend on your support here at the Zero Hour, so please give whatever you can at any of the links you see on your screen. Thanks so much.